Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Delphi Economic Forum. I am Ploutarchos Sakellaris from Athens University of Economics and Business. And this panel is on a very important topic, and that's why we were left for the very last panel. It's the topic of inflation. And we will be dealing with it today, discussing, debating. It's an issue that has come into our life recently, and it's something that most of us are not, some of us at least, are not so familiar with, as it has not been part of our life for several decades. And the costs could be enormous, both for individuals and firms. And what we are going to discuss today is how long will it last? What does it take to make it last longer? And what will be the economic effects? To see all of these things, we have assembled here a very distinguished panel that I'm going to call on a little bit to discuss and debate these issues. So we have Maria Demertzis from Bruegel. Welcome, Maria. We have Soňa Muzikárová from GLOBSEC Policy Institute. And we have Nadine Baudot-Trajtenberg from Reichman University in Israel. And we have Odendahl from The Economist. Okay, so to start the discussion, we have basically agreed to discuss some of the issues. What are the causes? And of course, we know that the issues behind inflation can be either coming from the supply side, can be coming from the demand side. It makes a big difference whether it's from one or from the other, and also it makes a big difference regarding what the policy response should be. So after sort of discussing these issues, we will see about monetary policy. What should monetary policy play as a role? Can it actually play a role if the shocks are as we describe them to be, or maybe not? And fiscal policy, should fiscal policy be used? How should it be used? Is it going to make any difference? So this is going to be the foundations really of what will lead us maybe later on to see, is this going to last long or not? And what are going to be the effects on our economies? And this is where we are also going to bring the regional element, because we will be talking about, certainly we'll be talking a lot about the Eurozone and Western Europe, but we have experts here on countries on the eastern side of Europe, and certainly we should not leave outside both our friends. We have an Israeli expert here in the rest of the world, including the United States. So, having said that, let me open up the floor by inviting Maria Demertzis to tell us a few things. Maybe, Maria, you can set up a little bit the scene in terms of what we're facing, because this is really a phenomenon that, as I said, is not something we have seen the last few decades. And then maybe give your own analysis of what's behind it, what should be done, and in short, and I'll come back to you with some follow-ups.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's interesting you said that inflation is not something we've seen in a long time, and you know, I'd like to start with that, because I was actually thinking of starting maybe 2 years ago, but I think maybe we need to go back, as you say,
yes,
to sort of remember that there were times where inflation was very, very high. If you think about the 70s and the reasons behind that. But it's interesting to think that the way that we've organized both central banks are the institutions who look after inflation, but also the way that we understand monetary policy, were all prescribed under the experiences of the 70s. And this, you know, monetary policy institutions are constructed to try and reduce inflation and tame inflation. But since that period of high inflation in the 70s, from the 80s and onwards, slowly inflation has becoming less and less of a problem. Institutions have been adjusting. And as you said, I mean, we've come now to the sort of the last 2 decades, and we've kind of forgotten a little bit about the problem there. What is an inflationary period, and why is this an issue? With that, we've seen that the instrument that we use to control inflation, which is, of course, the interest rate, and the interest rate in real terms, in terms of how it matters for the economy, has become extremely low. And for the longest time, we thought that actually we've conquered the problem of inflation, and there isn't really any problem to think about. I mean, the inflation is very low. Central banks are very successful in doing what they do. Everybody believes them. In other words, they're credible. And therefore, inflation is a problem of the past. Now, we go fast forward into 2020, and of course, we have a huge deflationary shock yet again, low levels of inflation, but also a very deflationary shock, which is, of course, the pandemic. Everything collapses. Inflation also is not really in the radar of anybody. And then some problems start emerging which make inflation, interesting again. Interesting in the sense that it's visible again in the numbers and everybody starts thinking about it. What is happening is we're having supply chain problems, and namely that we cannot actually fulfill the chains of production simply because production capacity is somewhere in the world constrained. And that is beginning to look in numbers, inflationary numbers. Why is that? Because we need certain parts of the economy, we can't get it, and all of a sudden the price of these things increases. So that was the first time we started seeing that. Then, of course, energy. About a year ago, energy started becoming a very big thing. And actually, if you look into what affects inflation, energy is the most volatile component. And is the one that really matters. When energy changes big, inflation will change big on either side. When inflation is very low, energy is because energy is very, very low, or when inflation is very high, it's because energy is very high. Now, where are we now? We are now in a situation, and I'm now talking mostly about the Eurozone, but the debate is very similar in the US, except more advanced, in the sense that inflation in the US is much higher. But, we slowly caught up with that. Inflation now in the Eurozone is, depending on whether you're looking at monthly inflation or whether you do yearly inflation forecasts, we are somewhere in the Eurozone between 5 and 6% in the baseline scenario, meaning if what we think will happen does happen, inflation is going to be between 5 and 6. Monthly inflation, however, on an annual basis is much higher, and it is very, very different between different countries in the Eurozone. I mean, if you go to the Baltics, we have double-digit numbers. Other countries are way below that. So, what does this mean? Prices are increasing at the, if you have inflation of 10%, it means that prices will be increasing on average in the country that you have this by about 10%. So, if you think about the value of your salary, it would be decreasing in real terms. You could buy 10% less because of the inflation. So it's a very big problem. What has contributed to that was initially energy, and for a very long time, and actually we've had lots of conversations with Christian as well on this, for a very long time I have believed that if you were to take energy out of the equation, then inflation will come back to not being a problem. So energy was the issue that was contributing to that, and as you said, Ploutarchos, it was really a supply side thing, and therefore monetary policy authorities couldn't and shouldn't do anything about it. They couldn't do anything about it. Now, I think those days, even in the Eurozone, are now over, as energy has gone up dramatically in the past few weeks, but gradually so, and of course, in the past few weeks, incredibly so. Just to give you a sense of how prices have gone up, a year ago, the oil was trading at about $45 to the barrel, which is the unit which we measure it. At the peak in the war, it became 130. This is, threefold increase in prices of oil. That really shows up in inflation. It really shows up in the numbers. But with it, both consumers and producers are wanting to compensate. Consumers are asking for higher wages. Producers are passing the cost on to their own goods. And therefore, we have what we now call secondary effects. And if you actually look at the components that would classify as secondary effects, they are slowly going up. And they will only go up more as those demands come both the consumer side and the producer side. So now the central banks actually can do something about it. They can do something about the secondary effects. They cannot do something about oil prices. The only thing that can stabilize prices is if the energy issue stops. The central banks can and shouldn't do anything about it. But they can do things about the secondary effects. And the question is, should they do that? And now I really focus on the Eurozone because the Eurozone is one central bank, very many different countries, very different inflation rates. What should they do? What should the central bank, the ECB, do? All the central banks in the world are faced with a huge dilemma, and that is that we are seeing both inflation go up, and in the instance of war, we are seeing growth actually reducing. So now you have a dilemma. If you were to interfere in the economy, the central banks were to interfere in the economy by increasing interest rates to try and control inflation, as indeed they should, they will be taming down growth further. So now this is a dilemma. And this is what we kind of put in the context of stagflation, where the central bank is really caught in a very hard place of how to manage this. So all central banks in the world, in the Eurozone, in the UK, and in all countries where this problem is emerging, have got this dilemma. But the Eurozone and the ECB has got one extra dilemma, and that is that by increasing interest rates, it will be affecting the financial aspects of the economy, the ability of countries to borrow, what we now know as financial fragmentation. And that, of course, is a very difficult thing for countries that have got weak fiscal positions, because their ability to help the economies in the very difficult position they're now will be compromised as a result of financial fragmentation. So we can talk a little bit more about that. Central banks are caught between a rock and a hard place, a lot more so for the ECB, where financial fragmentation really is an issue, and where the central bank really worries about. I mean, the last thing we want right now is for fiscal positions to be affecting financial conditions, because that's going to make it very hard for countries to finance their ability to help. And that, of course, is a reality for the Eurozone. I'll stop here.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Maria. You mentioned very importantly the experience of the 70s, which was actually the last dramatic experience that we had with inflation in the advanced world. And also you commented on monetary policy. My take of what worked at that time is that the interest rates had to be hiked to extremely high levels before actually the monetary policy could have any effect on inflation. So is that something that you see it? Of course, the 20s are different than the 70s and so on. Is that something that you see as being necessary for monetary policy? Well, let's talk about the ECB to be effective in controlling Eurozone inflation this time also, or are you foreseeing in what you described a more moderate or small interest rate hike to make the job that we require? So can it be effective, or do we really need to get sky high in interest rates?
It remains to be. I think the interest rates, of course, the comparison isn't entirely appropriate, because by that we were talking about a very different level of nominal interest rates by then. Now nominal interest rates are very, very low, so they do have space to increase. But if they were to increase at appropriate levels to meet inflation demands, the inflation component that monetary policy can affect, I'm not talking about the energy component, so really about the core HICP, that part is still actually quite small. Depending on how much the shock lasts, it will be an answer to your question. But I mean, it will be, just to give you an example, in the US, the markets are pricing 6 rate hikes this year. At the ECB, we are pricing 1, possibly 2. It remains to be seen how expectations will be formed in this.
Okay, thank you. Soňa, what is your take on the issue, and especially also on monetary policy? And in particular, if you can give us a bit of your angle on the economies that you cover and know so well, which are not so much the Eurozone economies.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ploutarchos, and thank you also to Maria for setting the scene so well. So my take is that I think the overall narrative and also the underlying conditions are really shifting from this transitory narrative that was prevalent in the post-pandemic environment. And I mean, rightly so, we have seen on the one hand the heightened energy prices that were, resulting from some OPEC decisions and stifled supply. On the other hand, we have seen emerging supply chain bottlenecks, but these were contained to specific industries and to specific things like semiconductors and chips. And also the reopening effects and the fact that there was a robust rebound in economic activity, which was quite abrupt, and you had this imbalance between supply and demand. But all of these things were kind of expected to resolve themselves with time. And then you have this Ukraine conflict or the Russian aggression supply-side shock, basically, and this hits in the environment of deficit spending, high debt, massive COVID fiscal packages at a time where a lot of the advanced economies are close to full employment. On top of all of these transitory effects that I have already described, and this has both short-term effects that we are already seeing, and it also has long-term implications, I would say even at a level of trends that we will be seeing for a long time. So I would debunk these kind of short-term effects and these long-term effects. So some of these things we're already seeing, as I have said. The booming energy prices, food prices. I mean, we know that both Ukraine and Russia are food cradles. Today I have seen on Financial Times that the global food prices rise at the fastest rate in 14 years to record highs. So this is significant, this is massive. Prices of raw materials, things like palladium, nickel, and related industrial products that are intensive in both energies and these raw materials. So this gets us to another thing, which is supply chains, and we have seen this on the one hand, but I think this will be at a quite different level. It will be much broader problem in terms of scale. It will not be contained to specific industry, and it will be also more acute and intense in terms of magnitude. And then there is this heightened pressure on public budgets on top of what we have, right? So in terms of public spending, we need to absorb the refugee flows from Ukraine and Russia, and this will, cost something to provide the necessary support and assistance. We need to offset basically the impacts of high energy and food prices on the most affected, the low-income households, which also will be costly. There will be additional spending on defense. I mean, it's all across the board. So we will see how the situation develops. There could be more short-term effects. In terms of, you asked what is my take on the monetary policy. So I think the sustained inflation well above the ECB target is certain at this point. And actually the ECB has forecasted this. They have done in their most recent macroeconomic projection, they have 3 scenarios. One is baseline, and there is the adverse and severe scenario, and both of those are well above the target. So I think they will be watching out for the anchoring of medium-term inflation expectations, and they have also voiced that they will be responding with, and I quote, policy optionality, gradualism, and flexibility, which, as I understand it, it means that they will be really calibrating their monetary policy and their decisions based on incoming data. And they will be also delinking the APP or the asset purchase program phasing out from interest rate hikes, which means that once APP is phased out, this doesn't necessarily automatically mean that there will be an interest rate hikes from what I understand. But I think there is a kind of long-term dimension to all of this, and this is actually key to the question whether inflation is here to stay. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I have 3 leading items on my list. The first one is that dynamics, and that's something that's here to stay. There is no appetite for austerity anytime soon for some of the reasons that I have already sketched out. Then the second thing is we have entered to an era of hostile geopolitics, and this has implications in its own right. Self-sufficiency and trading with more like-minded countries will be in the forefront and on the table. And I think, in fact, this is one of the leading lessons from the Russian aggression in Ukraine, is that in the long run, it's not really worth it to do business with autocratic countries. And it's not simply worth it to foster these kind of interdependencies. So the EU and also perhaps some other parts of the world will be, or Western allies to be precise, will be keeping an upper hand on strategy in industry. And we are already seeing much of this, for example, with the EU already setting goals for global market shares in semiconductors, in retaining battery production at home and similar strategic industries. So I think this is here to stay. This will be far-reaching. And then, of course, this gets us to the question of energy security and the green transition, which if there will be a rush to wean off of Russian energy, which it seems that there will be a rush. This will be also inflationary. And maybe my last remark is that since these trends are differently present in even different regions of Europe, this will make already tough decisions even more politically contentious, and then we can maybe get to the CE region and the eastern part a bit later. So yeah. I don't talk for too long. Thank you.
Well, very interestingly, you mentioned the green transition, and that's a very big aspect, I think, of what was happening before the war in Ukraine, and of course it keeps on happening now. So I would like later on to touch upon this after we've given the chance also to the other two speakers to speak, and to see to what extent this has been responsible in part for this inflation that we are seeing here, especially the energy cost rises up to now. And if so, whether that means that we should be transitioning, if we all agree that we should be transitioning to a green economy faster or slower than we had planned before. And I will come back to Central and Eastern Europe later, but let me give the floor now to Nadine, who would like to give us her own take on this, and also with her own experience of the economies that she's most familiar with.
Thanks. Christian, sorry, apparently it was ladies first.
Yeah, that's...
Well, as I said,
I'm calling... There will be nothing left for me to say, but no, go ahead. Maybe I can think of something.
I'm calling on the speakers in the order, yeah. Thank you.
I mean, for at least 12 years, if not longer, economists and central bankers were actually pleading for a return to some inflation. And remember, I certainly remember when I was a deputy governor in the central bank in Israel, we had almost 3 consecutive years of negative inflation, despite the fact that the economy was doing quite well. And this was a real problem. Where and how was the inflation coming back? And this is not only was inflation persistently low, but let's recall this was during a period with massive fiscal stimulus as well as massive monetary stimulus. This was created a puzzle, not only for central bankers, but certainly for economists. And I think it's a puzzle we have yet to resolve. But when I think, so there, we clearly had, until 2 years ago, a very strong undercurrent that was pushing prices down, and that wasn't allowing inflation to come up. And what I'm asking myself is whether this undercurrent is still with us, whether the factors that explain that undercurrent is still with us. And once we adjust to the pandemic and what it triggered in the labor and supply chain recovery, and what the Ukrainian war has also triggered, once we adjust to that, will we see a return to this undercurrent and going back to lower inflation? So let me remind ourselves of what were the main factors, and these factors were there for all OECD countries, basically. The first one, remember, was on the demand side. I mean, we had persistently a sort of a lower demand, too little spending. And the reasons we gave were in part demography, aging population, needing, not only were they leaving the labor force, but needing to live now decades on their savings and therefore high level of savings, and rising inequality of income so that the growth in income was going mostly to the wealthiest of households who would use those funds for pushing up asset prices and not feeding into the demand for goods and services, a persistently low investment, either because seeing that we were having a very, tepid growth, there was no need to add more capital, or alternative explanation were that the new industries, and particularly the industries linked to the digital world, no longer needed the same amount of large capital that traditional industries had. So, I mean, these are not all, but these are part of the explanation behind the secular stagnation explanation of this persistently low inflation. There were also, and by the way, in Israel, we felt that very strongly, there were also some positive element that was keeping inflation down. Globalization and the fact that you could, when facing rising domestic costs, that you could move your production to cheaper countries, that was also keeping the prices down. And we saw this a lot, by the way, in Israel. And also many of the OECD countries also underwent market reforms to make their markets more efficient and therefore to be able to provide goods and services at a lower price. So we had both supply expansion and also demand contractions, if you want, that were pushing prices down. When I ask myself now, and we are, 2 years in a pandemic that has yet to end, and it is clear, particularly with what is happening in China, the Ukraine war, and also another undercurrent that in fact started before and is just going to be accelerated with the Ukraine war, was the protectionist policies that we started having even before the pandemic and the lockdowns and before the Ukraine war. So one of the elements that had contributed, I think, to these, to this undercurrent of low prices, which was the expansion of globalization, has not completely disappeared, but is going to not only dwindle, but this reduction will be accompanying us for the years to come. So rebuilding the supply chain, as you mentioned, both because of the pandemic and because in light of the new world, I don't want to say the new world order, but the new world disorder, is going to mean increasing prices or pressure, I think, on rising prices. The second thing is, and you mentioned, the green energy. I think the commitment by countries, indeed, to tackle the climate change is going to be costly. And let's remember also that renewable energy type of industries are very capital intensive. And therefore, they're almost the counterparty to our new digital industries that require less capital. So I think that is another factor that will be here with us for the years to come. Not to talk about rising defense spending, which I don't think will crowd out other fiscal spending. I think we will just increase fiscal, putting aside, of course, the pandemic detour that we took there. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure just to increase government spending. And we are now in tight labor markets. It's particularly true, we see that in the US, but we see that in some places in Europe. We certainly feel that in Israel, and therefore we're seeing rising wages. I don't think any of these things are transitory. And I think that they're strong enough that in fact we are now in a inflationary environment which is there to stay. And with the very large consequences that we will see both on fiscal and monetary policy. And in my view, most of the central banks have been behind the curve.
Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, in the private communication that we had before, you also mentioned something that we have not discussed here, which is asset inflation. So asset inflation, of course, is nothing new. Non-conventional monetary policy probably led us to that. So it's something that we have been seeing for more than a decade now and so on. But you found it interesting, and maybe you can expand a little bit to introduce this element here, because we had asset inflation up to now for reasons that are related to the hypothesis that you mentioned earlier. Perhaps this didn't translate into goods and services inflation, but now we have both. Do you think that the fact that, whereas in the 70s, for example, we didn't quite have this also problem, one might say, because asset inflation is boosting consumption and so on, is going to make things harder or different in terms of how we should address these issues with monetary or fiscal policy?
So if you allow me 1 minute.
This is a question to you.
Okay, absolutely. I think that we have been blind to asset prices, to asset price inflation. And the same way part of our discomfort with inflation are the distributional consequences, I think with asset price inflation, it's even more so. We know that distribution of wealth is even more unequal than the distribution of income, and we've had massive asset price inflation. So the distributional impact, I think, is large, and I think we were, in a sense, too focused on our narrow definition of inflation. But you're right. If we are to focus also on asset price inflation, or just now on the inflation that we have, and monetary policy responds appropriately, which is to reduce its intervention and to increase interest rates, this will have a large impact on asset prices and will, to a certain extent, narrows the room to maneuver that central banks will have.
Yeah. Now, Christian, we just heard, one would say, a pessimistic view on what is ahead of us. So we are here. Inflation is here to stay. Central banks have been behind the curve, and so on. Probably a little bit more pessimistic than some other opinions that we heard here. Well, what is your take on, first of all, where do we stand, and why do we stand on this issue of inflation where we are right now? And secondly, can we do something about it? Can monetary or fiscal policy makers do something about it? And can you give us your assessment, being as stark or more optimistic?
Well, slightly more optimistic, I think, is what was just outlined in terms of the last decade of too low inflation, and what sort of lessons we need to draw from that, I think, is extremely important. But there is a bit of a difference between Europe and the US, and this difference has sort of informed me over the last couple of months. Because when you looked at European inflation versus US inflation, in the US it was really a combination of massive demand stimulus plus the supply side issues, whereas in Europe it was really mostly a supply side issue to begin with, right? Yeah. Then in the US we relatively quickly saw a wage spiral, whereas in Europe, to this day, we are not seeing a wage spiral, even though some of the indicators are ticking up. In the US, there was a relatively explicit political commitment to run a sort of high-pressure economy. In Europe, we are very, very far from that, right? So the fiscal policymakers will struggle to reprioritize, but I don't think it can all be done without, cutting other spending. Because in Europe, we do have a monetary union based on fiscal rules. They're currently suspended, but at some point we need to find a way to reinstate them. How is anyone's guess? Debt levels have increased tremendously through the pandemic and are now at levels in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, now even in France, that we would have considered just 10 years ago to be borderline unsustainable. So there are limits to what we can do in terms of running the same sort of policies as in the US. And now we have a war in Europe where the economic downside of which is largely felt in Europe and much less so in the US, right? So this is sort of this distinction between the US and Europe, I think is important because the policy setup is a bit different. Now, what can we do about it, right? So the ECB is in a absolutely terrible situation because it has a supply-driven, energy price shock-driven inflation to fight. At the same time, the more the war intensifies, the worse both factors become, the weakening of the economy and the rise in inflation, right? That makes the headache even larger. And the central bank reacting on an almost entirely supply-driven inflation shock is not ideal. Ideally, we would like to address this supply shock other ways. Of course, the ECB has to address this, right? Because once inflation is high and embedded, the way down to regular rates of inflation is a very painful one. And so, of course, the ECB, once it gets baked into wage and price expectations or into contracts and so forth, that's the moment where the ECB just has no choice but to weaken the economy, essentially, right? To take some of the pressure out of prices. And so, so the question is, are there any other policy levers that we have? The first is, of course, how do we agree on wage settlements? Yeah. In a market without that much labor side organization, of course, it's the market forces, the local market forces that determine relatively quickly where wages are going. Whereas in Europe, we at least have the potential, because lots of labor contracts are negotiated at the union level or at the sectoral level, to come to a sort of broader agreement that includes the labor side, the employer side, and the fiscal side. Because in some way, we need to be able to divide sort of this burden that we have to place on someone, right? It's clear that the wage sector, that the labor sector cannot be expected to bear that burden entirely. But at the same time, businesses have the same cost pressures and will not be able to sort of fully compensate for that. And so we will need to find a mix. So fiscal policy has a role to play in sort of providing some of the income compensation, at least temporarily, to make sure that these price increases do not immediately get baked into wage increases. And labor union and employer side also have a responsibility to make sure that, because this energy price spike, as extreme as it is probably at least in part temporary, that they agree on some form of temporary compensation. So, for example, as many unions in Germany and Austria, for example, have agreed on big one-time payments for this year, but a sort of more moderate trajectory of the overall wage level. And this is a combination that is less inflationary, because firms only have to pay sort of a one-time bonus, whereas their medium-term price calculations will be much more closer tied to the wage increase. And the final is of course, the green transition, since you mentioned it. I thought I mentioned it too. We have squandered 10 years of ultra-low interest rates by not investing nearly enough in the green transition, at a time when a very capital-intensive sector, a wind farm, once you build it, produces energy for free. But you need the capital investment at first. And we had a decade of essentially negative interest rates, right? My country, Germany, had negative interest rates even 30 years out. Almost any renewable investment would have been profitable from a societal perspective, and that was the time to do it, right? Austria was smart enough to issue a 100-year bond for, I think, 110 euros on $100. It's now worth 50, right? So this just shows you the amount of squandered opportunities that we've had from the time when people were desperate to lend money into safe havens and make some yield. And so I think this is where, this is now water under the bridge, but I think if we manage to, from the fiscal side, boost the green investment now into the low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency. I know energy efficiency is not as sexy, but it is one of the most important investment we can do. Absolutely. Then we will be able to make sure that this slightly inflationary push of higher fossil fuel prices, which will come inevitably because climate change reduces the profitability of investment in fossil fuel extraction. So if we have constantly rising fossil fuel prices, the more we can do to wean ourselves off off fossil fuels, the faster, the less inflationary that transition will be.
Yeah, well, thanks. You brought into the discussion a very interesting new element, which is the labor side, wage settlements, and also some way for fiscal policy to enter in there, so that we don't have this secondary round effect, so that the inflationary expectations are embedded. So that's very interesting. And this brings the question here. I would like to go back to Soňa. Some labor markets are very different than others. You mentioned already the US and EU differences. And also some fiscal policy capacities are very different than others. So coming back to Soňa, who is mostly involved in Central and Eastern European economies. On this side, and also you can bring in the monetary policy, how do you see the differences vis-a-vis the images that, or the descriptions that we've had coming from the US and the, let's say, Eurozone?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the region of Central and Eastern Europe actually just generally to the question of whether inflation is here to stay or it's transitory. The risk of sustained high inflation is very acute in general when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, and there is several factors for that. So you have these global phenomena like expansionary fiscal policies and tight labor markets, which is the case also for this region, but they're more of a global phenomena. But then you have these structural factors as well that are kind of more unique to this region. So you have extraordinary dependency on Russian energy, even within the European Union. Coal, oil, gas, and nuclear fuel. And for countries like Slovakia, Czechia, Hungary, or the Baltics, this ranges between 70% and 100% for different energy components and for different countries. On top of that, you have a very high manufacturing intensity that uses a lot of energy inputs. On top of that, you have a very high use of raw materials in industries such as the automotive, when we're talking about palladium, steel, aluminum, copper, commodities, all of these things. And then you have the geographical proximity to the conflict, which affects everything from a greater influx of the refugees and the related fiscal support and social support to exchange rates. So maybe just alluding to how the central banks of Central and Eastern Europe have been responding to this, they have actually embarked towards the end of last year on a path of quite aggressive interest rate hiking from the summer of 2021. And the main aim that they had was to contain inflationary pressures from these supply side bottlenecks and these high energy prices, these transitory factors that I was talking about at the beginning. And this was very much working because basically the koruna or the forint or the Polish zloty, they experienced demand and they were appreciating it. This was really assisting the central bank's anti-inflationary strategies. But what happens then, of course, is the Ukraine war, and this region has seen a huge capital outflow towards safe haven assets such as the US dollar and other ones. So basically these currencies have collapsed, and this is an additional huge inflationary effect basically for these countries. So really the central banks from this region, they have tried to cope with a mixture of FX interventions and further hikes. For example, the Czech Republic, their interest rate is currently at 5% on end, the highest level since 2001. And thankfully, these central banks, especially the Czech Republic, they have enough hard currency to sell and to basically prop up the exchange rate and get an assistance in this way. So there is some time buying going on there. I think countries like the Czech Republic, they have about 1 year to basically support the exchange rate. They will need to remain agile and responsive, these central banks, but I think the overall the effect and the sustained inflationary pressure will be much greater for CEE than for any other region within the European Union.
Great. So not a very pretty picture
No.
over there. That's what I'm seeing here. Just coming back to the energy, the green transition that Christian already commented on, but I would like also Maria and Nadine, if she would like to comment on that. So it's clear that the green transition, clear in my mind, you're welcome to disagree with me, actually created part of the problem with the energy costs, because it brought down the incentives to do infrastructure on the gray or the black energy and so on. So the infrastructure there has not been to the point where it could have been without the green transition. At the same time, we are in the case where we are realizing, at least in Europe and other parts of the world, that we need, I think some say actually, transition to a green economy much faster. And there are also opportunities from that, because investment of the kind that is needed for a green transition also may most likely bring productivity growth, improvements in the productivity, which will help on the supply side. So and of course help with the inflation problem. Any thoughts on this? I will start maybe with Maria if she wanted.
Yeah, thanks very much. If I may make a couple of comments on things that have
Absolutely.
been said, and then maybe come to the green transition, which is actually a big, in terms of the macroeconomic effects, I think there's still quite uncertainties, and I'll come to some of the things that also Nadine said. If I may, on the ECB forecast, because this is something that we actually do look very closely, and it is true what you said, Soňa. For this year, the ECB is forecasting very high inflation rate, over 5% in the baseline scenario, in the two very abrupt scenarios. It's actually interesting. It's the first time that the ECB is not quoting an opportune scenario and a risky scenario. They just quote baseline and two very bad scenarios. So it's just a reflection of the balance of risks, of course. And yes, in the worst scenario, it can go up to 7%. But it's this year. And even in the ECB forecasts, actually, the policy horizon, the inflation on the policy horizon, which is 2 years from now, inflation comes back below 2%. This is what they published on the 10th of March, right? So actually, arguably, if you wanted to be provocative, actually, they should cut interest rates because inflation is going to be below 2%, right? Which, of course, is you know, optimistic. I mean, do we believe that? I mean, I think it would be very difficult to argue for something like that. But it is true. For this year, inflation is very high. But unfortunately, no central bank can do anything about inflation this year. This is foregone. Any central bank is fighting for this of the policy horizons further ahead. So all of this to say that the uncertainty about what the policy should do is enormous. And I don't think that the ECB is actually looking at its own forecast right now. I may be wrong. I wanted to go back to what Nadine said. I thought the way that Nadine described the low inflation environment was absolutely wonderful. The secular stagnation arguments, what have been there, and the undercurrents. And I think correctly, Nadine, you asked the question, well, if we were to take away the energy crisis, will these undercurrents remain, or will they go away? And the answer that you gave, at least the way they understood it, is those undercurrents will go away. The globalization in reverse will imply that now the cost price will be inflationary. Now, I'm not entirely sure that this is decided, because if there were to be a sort of a globalization in reverse, or the onshoring, I think that's your argument, there will be a cost adjustment, but it will be an adjustment. What is the ratcheting effect that will make it inflationary? Well, there might be perhaps one period cost adjustment. You know, the markets would adjust to that. And what's the excess demand factor as a result of reshoring that will make inflation persist? That is not obvious to me, in particular because, as you also rightly said, there are other transitions that are going on. The digital transition in particular, which is, of course, in times of peace, the way forward. That is one that is not capital intensive. It requires very little capital. But then, of course, we have the green transition, and that is capital intensive. It's not obvious to me, and that's really the big question to ask, what will happen to the equilibrium interest rate? Because that is actually what will give you the answer to the inflationary pressures, right? And you know, to the extent that you're thinking about efficiency gains, either coming from the green transition or the digital transition, I'm hoping that the real interest rate in equilibrium is going to come up. Remember, our current estimates that the real interest rate in equilibrium is negative, which is, of course, very distortionary. What does it mean, an equilibrium price that is negative, right? So, I mean, I'm hoping that as the efficiency gains come from the digital transition and from the green transition, you will have one-off investments, but after that, there is no reason why, or at least not intrinsic reason, why they will be inflationary. Now, all of this, of course, on a piece of paper, right? I mean, the reality is that I don't know how the energy crisis is going to play out. I don't know how the secondary effects are going to play out. I mean, I think Soňa's point about food prices is really a crucial one, because it will have huge distributional effects as well, and distributional effects are long-lasting. These are the types of things that will make inflation last. and I'm talking about the Eurozone, I think Soňa's reasons on the region are different, and the exchange rate channel is crucial there. But in countries like in the Eurozone, where the exchange rate channel isn't of that much significance, it's not obvious to me, or at least I don't have the answer, that those effects will be persistent, either the globalization reverse or the green transition. I think there will be efficiency gains. Now, there are problems of the stranded assets that Ploutarchos actually raised. There will be stranded assets, and how do you decommission the stranded assets from the brown to the green? That's, of course, an important one. But again, why should that be inflationary? It will be costly, but why persistent inflation, right? So, I mean, I am a lot more worried about inflation than I was a few months ago, Christian. I mean, I think now we do have the second round effects. I mean, what pink typically in the ECB, rather pink, the pink components, they are catching up. And and the last thing I'll say is on the wages, how to distribute the burden. And Ploutarchos said that we have very different wage negotiation systems. I live in Belgium, where the authorities have asked the producers to increase the payroll 4 times by 2%. Right? But this is just an increase, an automatic adjustment, because we have automatic indexation in Belgium. Right? So there is no scope for negotiation. All of this is passed on onto the payroll. And of course, the ratcheting effect on inflation is huge. Inflation in Belgium right now is on a monthly basis, annually monthly basis is above 10%. And that, of course, is, how do you reverse that when you don't even have monetary policies is of course an obvious one.
I'm seeing that we have 3 minutes and 15 seconds. So what I will do is I will now give the floor to Nadine to make a very short ending statement, then to Christian, and then to Soňa.
So going back, in fact, to a certain extent our disagreement, whether there are new factors now that will be with us for a while and might counteract the undercurrent. Clearly, the factors behind secular stagnation, some of them are still with us. We're not getting younger, unfortunately, right? I mean, the aging, the demography is still behind. But some of the other elements are being weakened, and I think are being weakened for a certain period of time. When I say certain period of time, I have in mind for the 4 or 5 years to come. So for the 4 or 5 years to come, I see that the globalization force that we're pushing prices down are not going to be pushing prices up. Similarly, the tackling of the climate change, this takes a while. It's not just costly, it takes a while. These transitions take a while. And until they have evened out, we're in a process of having higher costs and thus higher prices. And this can trigger second round effect. And in the labor markets, these labor markets are different in different places, but certainly the labor markets in the US, the labor markets in Israel, we see that very much, are so tight that we're seeing increases in wages, which I see as a good thing, particularly given that one of the reasons for secular stagnation was also the inequality of income. But this means a reduction of this sort of mitigated demand. So when I look at the years to come, somehow I feel that many of us, including central bankers, we have yet to realize that these are new realities and the environment is going to be much more inflationary than what we have seen for many years.
Right. Now, Christian has very kindly given up his right. So, Soňa, very, very, very short, because we have 52 seconds left. Your last statement.
Yeah, thanks. So just very quickly, maybe on the green transition, I agree fully with Christian that we have squandered the last decade of low interest rates. I think we're past the point where we can take our time on the green transition and on slowly phasing out from the dependency on Russia, because there is a solidarity aspect at play here as well. Ukraine is fighting also for the values of liberal democracy, hence for our values, and it's to some extent to great extent actually, our moral duty to endure some discomfort. And for the region of CE, this could mean things like gas rationing and shutdown of non-strategic industries. So this will be if it happens fast, this will be a massive impact. But I think one thing that we need to ponder also is what is the counterfactual to fund the war. And I think the effects of a lingering conflict, even macroeconomically, will be very substantial if this thing just goes on.
All right. Thank you very much to our speakers, but most importantly to our audience that has stayed with us all this time so late in the evening. Thank you. And see you.